There's no reason why in this age of speed and technology we have to wait for tomorrow or even wait for going home and turning on our internets to find out what the professionals think just happened this evening. Because we have with us, not just on this panel, but in this audience more generally, we really have a stellar group of journalists who are with us this evening. It was really my privilege to be able to ask these three colleagues to join me on the panel tonight to offer some observations about Secretary Hagel's remarks, and, should they like, to put it into some broader context about the issues on the table that he raised and are at the top of the agenda for him and America in the Middle East. If I can just ask the servers to please conclude what you're doing and leave whatever else is there. Let me just very briefly introduce my panelists. On my immediate left, you don't often see his name in his magazine because he goes by Lexington, but he is Lexington of The Economist here in the Washington Bureau. May I please introduce David Rennie. Second on my left, Pulitzer Prize-winning national security correspondent of the Washington Post, Joby Warrick. And on my right, a person who I have volunteered in the past for important Washington Institute duties, such as serving as a juror for the Washington Institute Book Prize, Pulitzer Prize-winning Washington Bureau Chief Washington correspondent of the New York Times, David Sanger. So let me begin alphabetically, because he comes from a media outlet that is far, far away. Perhaps you have a very special impression of tonight's remarks by our Secretary of Defense, David Rennie.
Well, I thought that you stole the best line, obviously, which is that the Secretary did not use the phrase red lines in his speech. And I think that kind of goes to the heart of, for me, what we heard tonight was a speech that was, as an abstract piece of analysis that could have been given at any time in the last couple of years, it was a very impressive and intelligent sort of tour of the horizon. But given that the credibility of the United States and its government is currently being questioned, particularly because of the red line in Syria, and some would therefore argue that that then reads across to other red lines, it was pretty extraordinary that he didn't address that. And not only did the Secretary not address that, but it was a speech all about how the United States is in a sort of posture of passivity somehow. It's observing this complex, proliferating world, and will have to adjust to it, and will have to work with allies. Now, all of these things are tremendously wise observations and clearly responses to, the response to the last decade of $1 trillion spent on two wars that have not gone very well. But just before I leave it to the others, I would suggest, if you want to know just what an extraordinary speech we just heard, think about what we might have heard alternatively. I mean, it wouldn't have been so very outlandish for the Secretary to say, given that American credibility is at stake in Syria, as Secretary of Defense, I would like to clarify that chemical weapons are weapons of mass destruction that are against international law, that any commander of a military unit in Syria that uses these weapons will find themselves legitimate target for international action, that they may face prosecution. I think those would all have been completely legitimate things to say that would not have advanced American policy in dramatic new directions. And I think their absence was kind of close to shocking in some way.
Thank you. Okay, David?
thank you very much, and thanks for having me here tonight and being with all of you. I agree with David. I think you heard the speech of spokesmen for an administration that have been very reluctant interventionists. And when you consider the history of the past 10 years, the reluctance is somewhat understandable. When the president has intervened in the past 4 years, he has tended to do so using what in the White House they call the light footprint strategy, which has been the use of drones, the use of cyber weapons, particularly in the case of Iran, the use of special forces, if you think about the bin Laden raid. What do they all have in common? What they have in common is a desire to try to affect events in a narrow way for a brief period of time, but not to stay on the ground, not to send 100,000 troops into a country for 5 or 6, or in the case of Afghanistan, 11 years, and try to rewire that nation. And instead to go in and get out. And that's why I thought it was particularly interesting when toward the end of his talk, the Secretary said, the best hope for long-term stability relies on countries like Egypt, Libya, and Syria making transitions to democratic rule. That may be the case, but he then didn't follow that up by describing how the president's strategy would take you to democratic rule, which is a question of whether or not the United States takes an active role, does sort of what President Bush in his second inaugural, where the United States works very actively toward those goals, or whether, as David put it before, there is sort of a passive sort of observer sort of status to this. And that, I think, is going to be the fundamental dilemma of President Obama's second term. I think he has internalized the unintended consequences, as the Secretary said, of going in and intervening. And the question is whether or not that means we, as a nation, learned the lessons of Iraq accurately, or whether we have, as some might argue, overlearned those lessons. And Syria is going to be the first big, important test of that. I think if you take this speech together with what the president said last week, it's very clear there'll be no American forces on the ground. And I actually can't imagine right now what American forces on the ground could do there of great utility. But there was an absence of specific warnings, as David pointed out. And it'd be interesting to see a month, 3 months, a year from now, if President Assad is still in office, whether the missed opportunities to make warnings clearer in the end actually has an effect on his action as he reaches what presumably will be sort of more desperate times.
Okay, thank you very much, David. Joby?
Well, I have to admit I was personally disappointed with the speech, and that's because my paper is holding about 15 column inches of type for me to fill tonight. And I got a text a few minutes ago from an editor saying, well, did he commit any news? And I'm thinking, no, didn't commit any news tonight. And I guess in some ways that's expected. It's a stock speech. He said some of the things you would expect him to say to this audience in particular, support for Israel. But I think a lot of the things that you could almost see him wanting to give us a bit more and yet just pulling back, especially when it came to red lines. But it was interesting to me, there was some hopefulness that was expressed that either to me didn't seem warranted. Maybe there's just things that we don't quite understand yet. For example, this suggestion that there is a path now with the Russians to some kind of political solution to the situation in Syria, and yet no mention of the fact that, for example, today we're learning that the Russians are proposing to sell SA-300 or S-300 missiles to the Syrians, which completely could blow up the situation. And it's the same on Iran. There's just many examples like that, and one just has to hope that that there's a lot more that we're not hearing at this point, and just I hope that we'll be able to fill in that 15 inches at some point, but just not tonight.
Well, let me pick up on your last point, Joby. No 6-column headlines out of this speech, to be sure. Is there something that is going on behind closed doors, a decision that is coming down the pike about a change in America's engagement on Syria, for example, about the red line issue that we should all be expecting sometime in the near future? What do you hear?
David.
I think that we should all get together and crowdsource Joby's 15-inch story. If every table takes one paragraph, I think we'll get there.
Yeah.
When you think about what the president's options are in Syria compared to Libya, I think you understand why it is that he's feeling so constrained. So in Libya, you saw a large force that was approaching Benghazi and a dictator in Gaddafi who announced that they would hunt everybody down in the city. They had an opportunity to bomb them in the desert. They knew that the forces were fairly concentrated, they were fairly vulnerable. Syria's been the exact opposite. It's a war that's taking place in large part in very crowded cities. The opposition is spread out. A lot of the opposition members, the most effective fighters, many of the most effective fighters in the opposition are not groups that the United States or its allies are terribly eager to help arm. And so the president's got many fewer options. As I said before, I don't think he can put anybody on the ground. They could attack some of the chemical weapons depots, but you run the risk in doing that of creating exactly the kind of problem you're trying to avoid. I could imagine them, as been discussed in the Pentagon, the White House, and other places, coming up with a strategy for attacking the delivery systems, the missiles, some of the Air Force planes you could do from afar. The Israelis showed, I think, over the weekend that could be done even without entering Syrian airspace. That might create some sense of greater commitment and action, but I'm not sure in the end it's going to have any fundamental impact on the Syria that emerges at the end. And I think that's the problem, that all of America's means and its allies' means don't have a whole lot of correlation to the end state you're hoping to get to in Syria.
But here's the tension, I think, which is that it's interesting if you talk to allied countries that in some ways it's a sort of irresistible force, immovable object problem at the moment. And the immovable object is clearly the president himself, who is kind of, for all sorts of highly rational and intelligent reasons, signaling extreme caution and saying, you hear repeatedly when you talk to people in the machine that whenever someone comes up with an idea for doing something, the response from the president and his inner circle is, well, show me how this does not make things worse. And that's an incredibly responsible, and we heard that word responsibility a lot from the Secretary tonight. When you talk to allied governments who are looking to America to kind of give a lead, and for example, David Cameron is coming on Monday to see the president, and Syria will be a big part of that visit. What's interesting is that you hear them saying they respect, exactly as David said, he has no good options. This is all incredibly difficult. They understand the process by which the president arrives at this place where he has not taken action, and they respect that. But once they've sort of finished respecting that, they then turn around and say, but you know what? We're not sure that what's happening at the moment on the ground is sustainable. So we have a nasty feeling that at some point it will reach a level of horror or instability or will cross over so many frontiers that we will all be forced to act. And at that point, the costs will be much higher. It's incredibly uniform when you talk to, no matter how many allies you speak to. That's the discussion. So tremendous respect for the difficulty and the sort of caution of the president's position, but matched by this real sense of alarm that it's only going to get harder and that there will come a decision point sooner or later. So I think those kind of tensions are very visible. So that's sort of to answer your question about, are we going to see a decision?
Joby?
It seemed to me that precisely the same situation with Iran. I was struck by our luncheon speaker today who was talking about
This is member of Knesset Tzachi Negbi from the Likud party, close to Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel.
Saying very explicitly that he thinks by the beginning of 2014, certainly there will be a decision by Israel about whether not to use military force. And you contrast that with the kinds of solutions and remedies that are being discussed by the administration, possibly trying to increase sanctions, but by how much, and are they really working? Trying to arm our allies in the Gulf, but these are very long-term solutions. And does the clock run out before we get there? And I think that's an unanswered question, and it's quite a dilemma for these guys.
Well, actually, on Iran, if someone should stand up here for the Secretary's speech, if I were the Secretary, I would say, or trying to channel the Secretary, it would be, look, ultimately the big issue facing us is Iran, because there it's black and white. Do they or don't they get a nuclear weapon? In Syria, maybe we have a marginal impact on a very murky situation on the ground, and we're putting our resources, we're providing weaponry, we're making sure that all the assets are there to do what needs to be done if it needs to be done. Is that a reasonable position? Is that a reasonable interpretation of where the administration is, looking at the bigger picture of this?
Well, Rob, I think it's certainly a reasonable statement of at least the administration's public line on it, and I think it was a lot more consistent with the administration's spoken line on it than we heard from the Secretary during his confirmation hearing, when he had some difficulty in the containment versus prevention issue. And tonight, he went out and restated the prevention element of this. What it doesn't necessarily do is close the gap between where the Israeli position has been, which is to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear capability, and where President Obama's position was, which was prevention from getting an actual weapon. Now, if you listen to the president closely, I think in both the last presidential debate of the campaign, and again in an interview that he did with Israeli television just before he went to Israel, he's backed that up a little bit. He has said, you couldn't let them get too close to the actual weapon itself. So he's narrowed the gap a little bit between Prime Minister Netanyahu's position and his own. I think the big question here is, what happens if you hit a point where the Israelis believe that Prime Minister Netanyahu's red line, and he also, it's not just the President of the United States who's been setting red lines as well, has been crossed, and what the Israelis do if the United States doesn't believe that the situation is yet that critical. Because I just came back from Israel 2 weeks ago, and I think there was more of an acknowledgement, an explicit acknowledgement than I've heard before, that Israel simply does not have the capacity at this point to get to the deepest facilities that Iran has. That would be the Fordo plant. And a little more trust, I think, perhaps, that the president, when he said this and said it in Israel, means it. I didn't hear quite as much of the urgency that they had to go make a decision in the next few months. And I wasn't at your lunchtime talk, but I take it that the deadline has sort of been pushed to the end of the year, if we heard that correctly.
And I should also say, because you make the point that it's kind of the instinct of a journalist to pile into the powerful guy who's just given a speech. But you're right, we should look at what was sort of good in that speech and what was defensible. And in doing that, I should make the point that as a foreigner in the United States watching your politics, it's very easy for me, based in Washington, sitting on this table to say, of course he says this, this, and this because you've had 10 years of war and you've lost this many thousands of American lives and you've spent $1 trillion of American money. So that explains this. But actually, you shouldn't pass over that bit so fast. And I think that the rest of the world owes it to the American people to understand the extraordinary degree of blood and treasure that you have spent over the last decade. And of course, that is an absolutely gigantic political reality that weighs very heavily on this president and weighed very heavily. It was one of the reasons why he was re-elected. So he has a mandate for that. There is no doubt that the American public is not up for another war in the Middle East for incredibly understandable reasons. So people like me with my kind of, qualms about credibility need to be respectful of that. I guess where I am troubled sometimes when I talk to people in the administration as they kind of present this worldview, this new worldview, the more sort of, it no longer, I had this conversation with someone, I said, so are you still the indispensable nation? This is the obvious question to ask. And they said, the indispensable catalyst nation. And that's a kind of interesting nuance. And I think what concerns sometimes, and it sort of hovered around the Secretary's speech, is the idea that there aren't any really ugly trade-offs, that there are all sorts of kind of virtuous circles, that as America pulls back and as America asks allies to do more of the heavy lifting and to take more of the responsibility for their own security, and remember how much he talked about allies in the region, that will make them more responsible, that America, will force them to be a bit more grown up, that the removal of that kind of security, unlimited security guarantee will have beneficial effects. The problem is that as a politician, even as an American president, you don't always get to choose your own trade-offs. And I think I'd be a little more comfortable if, when making this argument for a kind of more sort of stand-back light footprint, as David said, if there was perhaps a more honest acknowledgement that there may be costs to that, there may be serious costs to that, totally understandable, and we need to have a lot of respect for the politics that got us to this place. But I'm always wary of the idea that these are cost-free choices and that there won't be nasty trade-offs. I worry that there might be.
Joby, you're getting a couple of inches out of this.
Oh, okay. Just keep. Just to echo, I think a little
into the mic.
On David's point, just to give the Secretary credit. I mean, it strikes me this is essentially the old, the core of the old Senate Foreign Relations Committee with Kerry and Hagel and Biden to some extent, and that same message that of essentially the humility in our foreign policy that you actually hear in is what he said tonight. Great powers use all of their tools, not just 11 carriers. No nation is going to be powerful enough to fix the problems on their own. These are very difficult and complex problems, and there is refreshing humility to understand that we can't do this by ourselves, and it does take other countries in the world working together, and it's going to take some time. It's not going to be easy.
The interesting thing is that for years we had many other American allies who said it would be nice if the United States didn't always play the 800-pound gorilla and let somebody else take the lead. And in Libya, that happened really for the first time. And I think the reaction of many others, including many of the NATO countries, was, what do you mean we're supposed to go do this first? I think there's a very conscious experiment underway here in saying that the president saying that what makes his administration different from the Bush administration is that while the U.S. will intervene unilaterally when its own interests are directly threatened, if there is just a general good out there, getting rid of Muammar Gaddafi, a country in which we did not have direct national interests, you might even say the same about Assad, although our interests are much greater there, that it's got to be the regional players, and you heard this from the Secretary, who put skin in the game and maybe put it in first. And I think it's going to take the world a long time to get accustomed to that. It's going to be particularly interesting if whoever President Obama's successor is, Democrat or Republican, takes this same view that the United States is no longer going to be sole policeman and sole enforcer.
Well, if indeed your premise is correct that they'll be looking for America, or America is looking for others to go first and to lead, to at least set the table for our actions, and perhaps others are looking to America. The Turks, the Jordanians, and others may be looking to America to project that leadership. Then let me just ask you very keen observers of this situation, do you anticipate any time in the foreseeable future a fundamental shift in our policy on Syria to a much deeper engagement? I'm not even talking certainly not talking Iraq-style intervention, but a deeper engagement in support of the opposition, or to use other weaponry to change the military calculus in Syria?
Well, I think that Britain and France, although both Britain and France are distracted and broke, but Britain and France would do much more tomorrow if America set the lead. You hear European officials will tell you that they think that there is still a way to get to the Russians, to draw the Russians into a process. Perhaps you could say to President Putin, you know what, when you warned about the risks of extremists, you were right and we were wrong, we underestimated it, so well done you. Come to the table, we can do this together. And I know that Europeans have been coming to Washington and making that case to the administration here. I also hear from Americans that they've turned around and said, you think we didn't think of that 2 years ago? And so there is a kind of sense of, as David said at the beginning, there aren't many good options, but I think there is that sense that this is not sustainable and that this is a very dangerous neighborhood really does get people's very serious attention, even in broke, distracted Europe. And there are people who would jump tomorrow to do more if America took the lead. But America remains the indispensable nation, whether America likes it or not.
Any other comments on predictions on Syria?
I just think you can't underestimate the ability of surprise just completely change the situation that we're facing right now. Just very few months ago, as some of us reported, there was a real possibility that chemical weapons are going to be used on a fairly significant scale, and because of U.S. intervention, it didn't happen. But it's who's to say that as things become more desperate there'll be events on the ground that'll essentially force our hand. I think that's probably more likely than not at this point, just my guess.
I would agree with Joby. There are a few things that could happen. If it turns out that the chemical weapons use, the very small-scale use that was detected in March, was government action, it will be interesting to see whether this was part of sort of gradual testing and escalation by President Assad, and that if he gets into a truly desperate situation, that he either uses or threatens to use them again. I think if that was the case, it probably would bring in not only the United States, Britain, and France, but probably a number of the regional players. What I think the president is going to have a hard time explaining is if you go back and listen, a speech worth looking at that he gave in March of 2011, right after the United States went into Libya. And he made an argument for humanitarian interventions in that speech. And at that time, there were maybe 10,000 plus or minus who had died very tragically in Libya. We're at somewhere between 70,000 and 80,000 in Syria. And I think there is going to be some kind of breaking point here, but I'm not quite sure where it is.
And if I had to suggest one other speech to look back on, it would be the president's speech at the Holocaust Museum announcing the formation of the Atrocity Prevention Board, in which, and I'm paraphrasing here, but the president noted that sometimes interventions are extremely costly and dangerous, but they're even more costly and dangerous if you wait to do it later. Ladies and gentlemen, on that note, please join me in thanking our panelists, Joby Warwick, David Rennie, David Sanger. And with that, it gives me a great pleasure to thank all of you. Some of you have been here from lunch through all afternoon and have now stayed through dinner. That's 9 hours of nonstop Middle East talk. You deserve a medal. Thank you for joining us at this year's 2013 Sorav Symposium. Good evening.